we can begin. I'm Arthur Buchman. There's my contact information. There's some information in the bio if you've read it or not. So credentials for being here. I've been in 2 different cults. One was a yoga group for 4.5 years. The second one was a pseudo-religious occult music group. And that was for 17.5 years. And the end of it was a lot of years in solitary confinement. So I have some, as they say in the American military, I've earned my stripes. That was a long time ago. It was 1990. I got out. I've been coming to ICSA conferences for the last 20 years or so, maybe 25 now. And I'm not really at the end of my career, but at this punctuation point in my career, I'm writing a PhD at the age of 81. And in this thesis, it's for Copenhagen University in the Department of Psychology. And my thesis advisors, who are unfortunately not here at this conference, are Rod and Linda Dubrell-Marshall, for those of you who know them. So I'm in very good hands. And for my thesis about cults, I had to define the word cult. I was told so by my censors, who said, you have some rewriting to do after I made my first submission. They wanted some explanation. So I have done so in my thesis. It takes up about 15 pages. You're definitely getting the streamlined version. And with that, I'm going to start. So the first, I think, important piece of information is that there is much, if not extreme, disagreement in the whole field. Should we even use the word cult? Somebody buttonholed me yesterday, and started saying, oh, we shouldn't use that word at all. We'll talk about that issue. But so the first thing is that there is, now how am I going to do this? Because this screen is here, and that screen is there, and you're there. So I guess I'll be turning my head. So there is no agreed upon definition, not in ICSA, and not in the scholars of new religions. So, and this reflects the diversity across the whole field. There's disciplines and scholars and researchers. So, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about this. And here's a nice quote: the cult literature is dominated by rhetoric, as well as personal and political and scientific agendas. So all the definitions that are out there, and this also applies to mine, they are not value-free. I'm attempting to look at the biggest picture possible, but that's a fact of the current state of affairs. In Europe, the preferred word in most languages is actually sect. So here it is in a bunch of different languages. The one I live in Denmark, so it's sect. We're in Spain, so sectas, and the rest of them apply. Well, we have German here, so secten and setten, if that's correct. Comes from the Latin. It's not important. The sociologists started discussing this issue, and this goes back to 1904, first written, where there are churches and they have subdivisions, and they were referred to as sects. And then the word cult was added as a subdivision of these derivative sects that Weber was talking about. And because this comes from my thesis, you get all the references. At the end, there's a link to references to all these names that I mentioned here. Most of them I will not drop. So there is a consensus that cults vary in the persuasive influence that they exert on their members, and that the people who belong to cults, they vary in their degree of involvement. And those are all the people who said things like that. At one end of the extreme, you have the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. The New Zealand folks aren't here, or the Australians. It's a recognized, legitimate religion in Australia. The members wear spaghetti straighters, colanders on their hats. They have a philosophy and they have some rituals, and it's their writings about themselves sound like a joke, but they're written seriously. So this is one end of the perspective of what's out there. And the other end of the extreme is Jonestown and the murder-suicides of over 900 followers, and that's 1978. And just as an update, over 400 deaths in a cult in Kenya. So this is unfortunately not a standalone example of just the range of diversity that we have in the cultic universe. So from seemingly harmless to murderously deadly. So there's some dictionary definitions, and this is interesting historically. So 1980, there's an American Heritage Dictionary. It's just the dictionary that I had at home. I looked it up. There's the word. Oh, this is a useful definition. A system or community of religious worship and ritual, especially one focusing on a single deity or spirit. Sounds reasonable and neutral. Also refers to obsessive devotion or veneration for a person or a principle or an ideal, and or an exclusive group of persons sharing an esoteric interest. Well, number one, what's the problem with that? And it's pretty neutral. The same dictionary, I went online to look for an update, 2022. Now they say it's a religion or religious sect generally considered to be extremist or false, with its followers often living in an unconventional manner under the guidance of an authoritarian, charismatic leader. The dictionary is making judgments. This reflects an evolution in all of society, and therefore we need to define this word, because the word cult is not going away. We cannot get away from using it. It is so much in common parlance, and the news have seized upon it, usually in the negative aspect. So we have to figure out, how do we use this word so that we're not lumping all the cults in Jonestown. So the scholars of new religious movements have made an attempt to do this. These are mostly sociologists of religion, and it is considered less pejorative, obviously, than the word cult. Eileen Barker is here at this conference, so she's has been one of the proponents of this term. I just had lunch with her, and she said they have even stopped using this for the problems I'm going to show you in a minute. So she uses the term minority religions. But a lot of cults aren't religious, so it doesn't cover the whole territory. But anyway, so there was an educational cult in Denmark called Twin, and they're not religious at all. So it's a sociological, anthropological approach, and it doesn't consider psychological processes. I'm a psychologist, so that's my interest. It also doesn't talk about how people might be affected negatively or positively, for that matter. Their tendency is to just observe things and leave them alone. As a therapist, that's not what I do. And one of them has actually written that the terms are chosen for broadly political reasons. And there's a whole history of the cult wars, which is still alive and well. It's just not being waged anymore. Differences are out there. So you have disagreements over the words new and religion. TM, they say they're not a religion, but they use Hinduism and their guru was Hindu. And so is it or isn't? So it's hard to define that. What about Christian Science or the Mormons? How new are they? They're both started in the 19th century and they're thriving. So this author named, oh, I can do this, right. Hjelm, and I don't know who he is, but it's a Danish name, says that new means either that the movement has no substantial traditions, or that they've invented traditions for the self. The main point is there's no single criteria for putting people in this particular box. So there's more to it than that. So yeah, disagreements over the words new and religion. Oh, I duplicated that. Okay, we'll skip this. So here is my take on the worst aspect of this particular approach. That, and I don't even know who the author is. I got his name, but I don't know him. And the only representative of this school who comes to ICSA conferences is Eileen. She's been doing that for as long as I've been coming here. So new religious movements, numbering in the thousands when looked at globally, show how the language of spirituality constantly recreates itself to address the needs of emerging cultural identities. The enormous variety of these innovative systems shows the naturalness of religious world building, each offering a new set of ontological markers and new interactive objects of authority and communication. They do this as naturally as any species will form a habitat. I've tried to read that in a not sarcastic way. What are they talking about? Okay, people. I think they're talking about people. They're dehumanized. They're reduced to cultural identities and interactive objects. An inanimate organization is now compared to a living species. So this is just it's newspeak. This is exactly what Orwell put into his book 1984. Lifton would call this loading the language. Won't go into this in more detail, but this is one end of the spectrum. So there's no concern for the uniqueness of individuals or their lived experience, and no attempt to make any changes or recommendations, except to be allowed to continue to write like this. Psychological perspective is very different, and this is my perspective. We're concerned about individuals and groups of people, and those who experience it, and the people they experience with. It's an interactive experience. We're also interested in who leads cults and the dynamics within these groups. And religion and ideology is not important, and we're not particularly interested in defending the religious freedoms of groups to exist no matter what. So, in my thesis, I can't include stuff like this, but I can do it here. So, and this is from 1873. Cult is a term which, as we value exactness, we can ill do without, seeing how completely religion has lost its original signification. So, and cult, here's a great definition. It's an organized group of people, religious or not, with whom you disagree. So the word is thrown around in our culture a lot. And here's a more academic version of the same thing by my thesis advisor, Rod Dubrow-Marshall. The cult is an imperfect and ambiguous term that has problematic associations with media stereotypes. So in trying to say, what does the word mean? We're up against all of this. This is just the background. So inside ICSA, inside our world of former members and people who want to work with them and make a difference, there have been attempts to define this word. First one goes back to in the 1980s. I'm sorry, Mike Kropfeld isn't here, but one of the authors who wrote about this, it's a cult, a group of people united around a particular ideology, a group of people who have split from a dominant religious group, distinguished from a destructive cult that is highly manipulative group that exploits its members, and it can inflict psychological, physical, or financial harm upon them. This is still not particularly lumping all the cults with Jonestown. And very important, and I've highlighted it in yellow, they say the word can. So they're not saying all the cults are like this and not all the cults do this, but that they can. And that's a very important distinction to see later on in my definition. I say sometimes and perhaps and could for the same reason. But their definition evolved. So in the 90s, now it's much more like the dictionary definition that we came across. A cult is a highly manipulative group as compared with, oh, we got this thing, all right? So not just a group of people united around a particular ideology, it's a highly manipulative group. It exploits its members and it can cause, still permissive, psychological, financial, and physical harm. It dictates in an absolute manner the behavior, thoughts, and emotions of its followers. Manipulation techniques are used to transform the new recruit into a loyal, obedient, and subservient member. Cults claim a special status for themselves or their leaders that usually sets them in opposition to mainline society and or the family. Cults conceal their real nature and goals from prospective members by adopting deceptive behavior in order to attract new recruits. So it's like 15 years later or something. This is the focus of InfoSec, that they're partners with ICSA. So although I have not seen this definition, I had to do a lot of reading that I never expected to for my thesis, and I've never seen anybody else use InfoSec's definition. But you can see again, there's a trend to really paint it black. Now there's the psychiatrists. Levine and Galanter are both psychiatrists, and Levine said that cult is so pejorative, it's such a nasty word that the groups that they're being referred to, there's no good word to do it, so he rejects the word cult altogether and calls them radical groups. Because in the minds of the people who are concerned about the people who are in these groups, they're seeing radical changes. He's mostly talking about parents in the members. So he's trying again not to lump all the cults in with the worst ones together. Here's a definition by psychiatrist Galanter. That guy. A charismatic group, that's his word for cult, a close-knit community defined by that it has a strongly held belief system and a high level of social cohesiveness. Its members are deeply influenced by the group's behavioral norms, and they impute a transcendent or divine role to the leader. So again, they're not trying to say that it's all terrible, or even that it's terrible at all. He leaves it out of his definition, but in the very next paragraph in Galanter's book, oh, that's the wrong one. He acknowledges that considerable privation, it's like deprivation. It's one word removed from harm, all right, is the general result of belonging and members having to try to live up to something that's impossible. But he doesn't include it in his definition. So can't argue with the guy, but this is, again, an approach trying to define cult and leaving out the problematic aspects. Now we have definitions by people close to home. So Lifton made a speech, talked about it, and he acknowledged, let me remember I have this, that the term is pejorative. So then he goes on to say, what is the negative rap? It's a cultic group it'll be totalistic, practice thought reform, shift a convert's generalized spiritualism to worship of the guru, sexually, financially, and in many other ways, exploit the convert's spiritual quest. Well, frankly, not all the cults are after your money. The two groups that I were in weren't concerned about money, particularly anyway. And there was certainly some sexual hanky-panky and control going on, but it wasn't the main focus of the group. So, and Herb Rosedale was the president of ICSA. So that's the context that this quote exists in. So yeah, sex and money, not known to be common to all of them. So Rod and Linda Dubrow-Marshall in the published article, a broad range of high demand environments whose common MO is high levels of control and influence or undue influence. So there was some discussion of undue influence several times in this conference, so we have to talk about it. But anyway, this definition, it gives you a sense of it, but it just leaves out some of the large and problematic aspects of cult. But what is undue influence? It's a legal term. Steve Hassan talked a lot about it last night. And it's not worldwide, but it's in a lot of European and also Australian countries, for exploiting a relationship of unequal position and power, which is how it is in cults. You have unequal power. But again, it's just not covering the whole territory. Now we have the American Psychiatric Association, excuse me. So it's a religious or quasi-religious group characterized by unusual or atypical beliefs, seclusion from the outside world, and an authoritarian structure. Cults tend to be highly cohesive, well-organized, secretive, and hostile to non-members. So important here is the word. Where is tend to? There we go. That they tend to. Fair enough. So this covers a lot of territory, but not all of it. And again, not all groups are like that. They're not all living in ashrams. Here's a simpler definition: an ideological organization held together by charismatic relationships and demanding high levels of commitment. By our friend and colleague, the late Ben Zablosky. So this is Rosedale and Langone, two past presidents of ICSA, quoting Zablosky's definition. This is still from 1997. And then they stop there, and after they give their definition, then they give a warning about the risk of exploitative manipulation and abuse and harm, but they leave it out in definition. So writing my thesis, I'm trying to pin this down somehow. And this might be acceptable to scholars of new religions movements because it's not particularly pejorative. It's just all of these definitions have something to offer. They just, in my opinion, don't cover enough of the territory in enough of the right way. So now we have some more definitions. How am I doing for time? I have 20 minutes. This is slide 14. I'm going to skip these because there are more examples of the same. People trying to get a verbal description of what it is. Okay, here's a simple one. Carmen Almendros is here today. Psychologically manipulative group. Yes, no one's going to disagree with that, but what about all the other aspects that are concerning us here? So an authoritarian ideological group. Here's Yanya Lalik's definition. I'm just going to skip that. Now comes the definition most used in cult recovery literature by Langone and West. So a cult is a group or a movement that, to a significant degree, A, it exhibits great or excessive devotion to some person, idea, or thing. It uses thought reform program to persuade, control, or socialize members. It systematically induces states of psychological dependence in members. I mean, just a comment there. Systematically, they do induce states of dependence, but systematized, they haven't got it all figured out and written down in the manual. Some do. It exploits members to advance the leadership's goals and causes psychological harm to members, families, and the community. No might cause harm, no could cause harm, no sometimes. So this is a sweeping condemnation of all cults. And there are so many groups we know nothing about. That's what we found out when this tragedy took place in Kenya. Totally unknown group, flying completely under the radar, shows up and starves children and adults to death in order to meet Jesus sooner than the end of times come. So, but they're not all like that. They don't all cause psychological harm, and for that matter, they don't all harm the community. So, but these are the authors, just some of them, who use this definition in their published literature. So, okay, so right, they don't all conform to this. So there's still no consensus. There are some more out there that I didn't include, but this is the range of options that I had in writing my thesis to try and say, what am I talking about? So there's no consensus. Lifton himself has said that neither his definition or any others are value free. So should we just use the Weston Langone definition? That would satisfy some people, and that's what's been going on since the 90s. This is 2024. So there's a broad spectrum of groups that needs to be included, and you can't lump them all with the worst aspects of cult involvement. So, right. So these definitions are either too limited or too declarative, and none include, and perhaps were not necessarily intended to include, the full range of cult phenomena. We just don't know the motivation even of the authors. So, criteria for a new definition. Cult is a more recognizable term than new religious movement. And even Eileen Barker's transformation to using minority religions, it just doesn't cover all the groups that are out there. We need a definition that has greater utility, and to address the shortcomings of these preceding definitions, be fair to the groups that are weird and strange and out of the mainstream, but that they haven't been clearly demonstrated to cause terrible harm to their members or society. And to try and represent the known variables, this is what I'm doing. This is the definition I'm using for my thesis. I actually discussed this with Ron Linda, so can I get some feedback from the audience and, you know, bolster this up and plug it into my thesis, which I'm just concluding now. And they said, no, you don't have ethical permission to ask these questions of the people who are here, and you have to get ethical permission from your university. So I would love to get some feedback from all of you, but it's not going to be in my thesis. It might be in the follow-up article to this that gets published, but not for this. So, oh, I went too far. How do I go back?
The other one, last one.
There we go. So a cult is a distinct group of people typically organized around a charismatic and authoritarian leader or leadership structure that promotes a unique and often religious ideology that provides an identity for its members, setting them apart from others. Cults may have coercively controlling and isolating conformist culture that can result in considerable privation and a significant degree of surrender of personal decision-making, with sometimes harmful consequences to members and society. Some cults have totalitarian ambitions. So it's a mouthful. What's the wonderful anachronism? Keep it simple, sweetheart, right? Can't be done. I couldn't do it anyway. So there are elements of the definition. There's a structure. there is leadership, there are beliefs, there's identity, there are membership demand characteristics, things you have to do and also must not do. There are human consequences and societal risks. So, all right, we'll just go for it. So the distinctive group of people aspect of it is that people are connected to each other in cults. I mean, there are cults that are less so, but generally, if you belong, you have something going on with other members, and it goes through the leadership and revolves around it. In many groups, members are identifiable, at least to themselves. We may not know the signs. Where my daughter used to live in downtown Copenhagen in Newhound, there's a Scientology center down there. And at meeting time, the whole neighborhood would be swarming with people in, white shirts, black pants. It's not strictly a uniform, but there's a dress code. And they recognize each other. You can also recognize these people, by the way, they're not making eye contact with anybody on the street. And I'm sitting in the car waiting for you, and all these creeps are going by, and I'm just sitting there in silence. But so people are recognizable unto themselves, and that's important. They have a psychological bond. It means something to them. It's shared, and it separates them from others, at least to themselves. There's a reverence for, there's a teacher, and they revere all of this. There are things you should do and shouldn't do, and that is generally very explicit and also impossible to fulfill. That's not part of this. And they have their own language in many cases. So they bond with each other. I'm going to have to go faster. So they're organized around this charismatic and dominating leader. Notice I say typically. AA, for example, and various 12-step programs, they're leaderless. Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a guru. They have a founder, so they have a governing body. So it's not always that there's just one person, but there is a leadership structure. It directly impacts members' lives. It's the leader or leadership or the rules that have been written down after they're all dead and gone that tell people what you have to do to belong. It is authoritarian. A lot of these leaders say that they are the Messiah and they are worshipped as walking deities and this sort of stuff. But not all of them, but they claim to be godlike, which means they're not accountable to anybody. If you're God, you have all of your options. And if you're a follower, you just can't complain that God has done something wrong, because that goes against the definition. Anyway, so the things that they say and do, they may be binding upon their followers. And for those of us who followed such a person or met such a person, they are charming as all get out. The charisma is palpable. You can feel it, and it's amazing, and it's attractive, and it's dangerous. And they can be narcissistic. So you can hear that I'm saying they can be and they might be, but they direct their followers' behaviors. And they have the power to impose consequences, and they do. I have 5 minutes left.
9.
10.
9.
9. Okay, great. They have an ideology. It's unique and it's often religious, but it isn't all the time. Here's where the controversiality and the unconventional nature of it comes in. There's a wonderful, and most of them are religious. They have all these other kinds of groups. There's this wonderful book by Chrysides and Wilkins. I don't know, it's got 50, 60 of the faith documents of the different cults in their own words, saying this is what we believe, this is why our guru is the Messiah, this is why we have the only truth. How many messiahs can you have? How many ultimate truths can you have? It's a wonderful book just to convince anybody they can't all be right. But there's a huge diversity. And a lot of them are Christian or pseudo-Christian, so they have similarities and overlaps, but they can all tell why they are different and the only true path.
What's the name of the book?
Uh,
Doesn't matter if you don't.
Slips my mind at the moment, but you Google these guys and you find, you're right, it should be here. So, and they make promise, oh my goodness, but we all know about that, all right? None of which, by the way, have ever been validated. You know, people in TM are not levitating.
Really?
I'm sorry to, break the news to you, but
I don't know, my granddaughter, she loves to fly when my friend carries around like this, and I say it's just military.
exactly. So identity is an important aspect, that it sets people apart in a way that's meaningful. Belonging is really important. And it's one of the attractive elements of any group, including cultic ones. And then there's those who belong and those who do not. And in many cases, there's this inner out mentality, which Lifton calls the dispensing existence. So, 166,000 of us are going to be saved, and all the rest of you are doomed. And the group has more numbers than that in their membership. I don't know how they solve that, but that's just an example. Consequences, also socially, then everybody else is other, unworthy. 5 minutes. Okay, so, and Julie Jenkinson, who's here, talks about this. People get their identity is a pseudo personality. These people are not the way they were before they joined. And after they leave, they're not the person they were in the group. So potential membership demand characteristics. Don't have enough time to do the whole thing, but the requirements are for a level of purity and devotion that is impossible. And very often it's not disclosed up front. Come to a Bible study is how they get you in. What you have to do once you've enjoyed their company and cookies and whatever is totally unrevealed at first. They have coercive control over the members. Daily life is micromanaged. Sexuality is directed in at least 2 ways. One is you can't have anybody except under the conditions that we prescribe, or everybody's having with everybody. You can't say no to that either. Either way, they're preventing people from joining pair bonds that direct the attention of their love to other than the guru or the group. People have to give up careers and education also. They're isolated. Yes, I talk about this not because it's so common, because it's part of my experience. 12 years in solitary confinement, folks.
Which group?
It's just a nameless musical group that nobody ever heard of. It doesn't exist anymore. Doing that to various musicians who were out of favor with the leader. I mean, so it's just, we're talking about potential membership demand characteristics. That's one of the extreme ones, but I throw it in there because it was my experience. Possible consequences, okay, to members and society. We know about the consequences: child abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, murder, suicide, loss of all kinds of opportunities and your money and your family, and psychological suffering across a broad spectrum of symptoms, and adjustment difficulties when leaving. And some cults have totalitarian ambitions. They want to take over the world. Even in Scandinavia, there's a right-wing group that wants to overthrow all the governments and have some kind of martial law. Also in Denmark, Hizb ut-Tahrir, they want to impose Sharia law in Denmark. So totalitarian ambitions. That's the package. These are the elements of my new definition. Don't I have some conclusions? Whoops. Have some examples. Yes, okay. So it's a descriptive category. I'm trying to use the words may perhaps and often because I want to be inclusive, but I want to allow for the fact that there are groups around there that meet and they're weird and they're different and they're not harming their members, or are they? We don't even know because we don't even know these groups exist until they surface. And it's not news. It's never going to be in the paper that there's this weird group and they do interesting things, but we don't understand it. That's not going to sell newspapers. Kill 400 people. That's when you find out what it is. So this is a hybrid definition, greater than the sum of its parts. And I aim to be less pejorative and less adamant and more accurately and more comprehensive than the existence that are out there. And it's a working definition of cult synthesis that grew out of reading much more than I ever thought I would or would have to come up with this. And also, I'm taking it this far, but you can use it as some kind of checklist, some kind of, does the group do this? Do they have this? It has that potential to be a guideline. Feedback and commentary, welcome if we have time for it. There's a link to references so you can get the slides. This is going to be publicly available. I don't know how they're going to do it. And there's my email. And thank you so much.